On the morning of October 16, Itenjo by Wushar, 3 livestock trucks stood outside the Cedar Ridge sale barn before the sun had cleared the eastern hills. They had traveled more than 600 miles from North Carolina. By 8 o'clock, farmers had begun gathering along the loading pens. Some leaned against the rails. Others stood near the auction office with their hats pushed back, trying to see the papers spread across the desk inside. No auction had been scheduled that morning. No public notice had been posted. Yet nearly every hog farmer in Cedar Ridge County seemed to know that Jonah Hale's small black hogs were about to leave Arkansas. At the center of the office stood Daniel Reeves, livestock manager for the Blue Ridge Orchard and Provision Company. Beside him was the company veterinarian. County agricultural agent Frank Dillard stood near the certified scale records. Across the room stood Preston Vale, president of Cedar Ridge Farm Bank and chairman of the County Swine Association. Daniel placed 3 documents on the desk. The first was a bank appraisal of Jonah Hale's 76-acre farm. The figure at the bottom read $4,600. The second was an offer Preston had made during the previous year for 12 of Jonah's best sows and 2 proven boars, $1,450. The third was Daniel's written offer for Jonah's complete breeding herd, $5,250. Daniel put one finger on the appraisal and looked at Preston. "Mr. Vale, is this your bank's valuation of the entire Hale farm?" Preston's eyes moved from the appraisal to the crowd outside the office window. "It is. The house, barn, pasture, woodland, fields and water system?" "Yes." Daniel touched the second paper. "And is this your signature on an offer for 14 foundation animals from Mr. Hale's herd?" Preston looked down. "It is." Daniel moved his hand to the final document. "Then my offer for the complete herd is $650 more than your bank says his entire farm is worth." No one in the room answered. Outside, 52 black hogs waited in 3, holding lots. They were not unusually large. They did not have registration papers from a famous breeding association. Their bodies were shorter than the white commercial hogs Preston displayed at county fairs 3 years earlier. Men in that same building had laughed because Jonah paid $682 for the animals from which the herd had been built. Now 3 trucks had crossed 6 states to collect them. Daniel looked toward the pens. "I want to see them move one more time." Jonah handed a dented tin feed bell to his 17-year-old son. Ben Hale stepped into the alley and rang it twice. The sound carried through the barn. Every black head in the first holding lot lifted at once. Then the hogs turned toward the gate. The farmers along the rails stopped talking. They had seen hogs pushed with boards, dragged by ropes, and scattered through loading alleys. They had seen men spend an hour trying to force 20 frightened animals onto one truck. Jonah's hogs came forward as a group. At that moment, everyone remembered the day Preston Vale had held up that same bell and told Jonah to ring it until his worthless hogs grew. But the story had not begun with 3 trucks. It had begun with 4 families leaving farming. The liquidation sale. In the autumn of 1949, 2 poor corn seasons struck Cedar Ridge County, one after the other. The first had been damaged by late rain. The second was weakened by summer heat and an early dry spell that left ears short and poorly filled. For larger landowners, it was a bad period. For smaller farmers carrying equipment notes, feed accounts, and medical bills, it was the end. The Carter family sold first, then the Bells. The Masons held on until September. When their bank refused to extend a machinery note for another season, the Reed family left after Mr. Blancs. Reed injured his back and could no longer manage the farm alone. Their cattle, tools, and household furniture were sold separately. Their remaining hogs were moved to the Cedar Ridge sale barn for a county liquidation sale. By 7 in the morning, 4 groups of small black hogs stood in 4 pens behind the auction building. The Carter lot contained 12 mature sows and 5 gilts. The Bell lot contained 9 sows, 1 boar, and 6 young gilts. The Mason lot contained 10 sows, 2 boars, and 5 gilts. The Reed lot contained 7 sows, 1 boar, and 6 gilts. 64 animals in all. They were not identical. Some had white marks on their feet. 2 sows carried narrow white bands across their shoulders. 1 boar had a torn ear. Several animals were thin from the poor summer. The traders who arrived that morning walked past the breeding pens and examined the young barrows intended for slaughter. Commodity buyers wanted hogs that could be assembled into uniform truckloads. They wanted weight, speed, and predictability. A mixed collection of small breeding animals from 4 failed farms required time, fencing, health work, and careful selection. Most buyers saw expense before they saw value. Jonah Hale arrived with Ben in an old farm truck that coughed whenever it climbed a hill. Jonah was 46 years old. His farm lay 12 miles north of town, where the flatter corn ground rose into rocky woodland. He owned 76 acres, a weathered house, a narrow barn, 2 small fields, and more oak-covered hillside than most farmers considered useful. Nothing on the farm was new, but nothing was mortgaged. Jonah stopped at the Carter pen first. He did not begin by asking how much the hogs weighed. He watched how the sows stood. He examined their feet and legs. He looked at their udders for damaged or unusable teats. He checked their teeth to estimate age. He asked which animals had raised litters during the previous spring. At the Bell pen, he watched a sow turn when one of the gilts squealed behind her. At the Mason pen, he stepped inside and waited to see which animals panicked and which moved away without charging. At the Reed pen, he studied the worn earmarks and compared them with handwritten notes attached to the sale sheet. Ben followed him from pen to pen. "They're small," Ben said. "I can see that. Mr. Vale says the packers are paying for length now." "They are. Then why are we looking at these?" Jonah reached inside his coat and removed a black cloth-bound ledger. Its corners were worn smooth. Several pages had come loose and been stitched back into the binding. The ledger had belonged to Jonah's father. "I'm looking," Jonah said, "because everybody else already decided what they are." Preston Vale heard him. Preston stood near the auction office wearing a gray felt hat and a clean brown coat. He owned a large white hog operation on level ground south of town. His animals won county classes because they grew fast, finished well on corn, and looked almost identical when they entered a show ring. Preston understood the market he served. That was one reason people listened when he spoke. He came to the Reed pen and looked over the rail. "You planning to buy a butcher hog?" he asked. "Maybe more than one." Preston smiled. "Then buy the young barrows and leave those breeding animals alone. They're leftovers from 4 farms that couldn't make them pay." Jonah closed the ledger. Those families had more trouble than hogs. Trouble still has to be paid for. The auction began at 9. The young slaughter animals sold first. Then the auctioneer moved to the breeding pens. The Carter lot opened at $150. No one bid. The auctioneer lowered the opening price. Jonah raised his hand at $140. A trader offered $155. Jonah bid $160. The trader hesitated, added $5, and then stopped when Jonah answered again. The Carter lot sold to Jonah for $174. A few men turned toward him. The Bell lot came next. Jonah bought it for $139. By the time the Mason lot entered the ring, people had begun whispering. Preston stood near the scale gate with his arms folded. Jonah paid $181 for the Mason animals. When the Reed lot entered, Preston spoke loudly enough for the men near the front to hear. "Jonah, those aren't breeding hogs. They're feed bills with ears." Several farmers laughed. Jonah bid anyway. Another man called out, "Maybe he plans to sell them by the inch." Someone near the door answered, "He'll spend more on corn than they'll ever bring." The Reed lot rose to $188. Jonah made the final bid. The auctioneer struck the desk, sold to Jonah Hale. The total, for all 4 lots, was $682. Preston walked to the gate, where a dented tin bell hung from a nail. The auction workers used it to call attention before a new group entered the ring. He lifted it by the handle. "Take this with you." "Jonah." Jonah looked at him. Preston rang it once. "Ring it long enough?" And maybe those little hogs will grow. The laughter was louder this time. Jonah took the bell. He did not tell Preston that size was not the first question he intended to answer. He did not explain the numbers inside his father's ledger. He placed the bell in the truck beside the book and began loading 64 animals that most of Cedar Ridge County believed would consume more money than they could ever return. Every dollar he could afford to lose. Ben waited until they were several miles from town before speaking. You spent everything. No. You had $694 this morning. I spent $682. That leaves 12. That's right. The barn roof leaks. I know. The well pump makes noise every time it starts. I know that too. And we don't have enough corn for 64 more hogs. Jonah kept his eyes on the road. Then we won't feed them like Preston feeds his. Ben looked back through the rear window at the livestock trailer. The night before the sale, Jonah had opened a metal box beneath his bed. It contained $426. That money had taken years to save. Before sunrise, he had sold 5 feeder calves to a cattle buyer for $268. 426 plus 268 made $694. After the auction, $12 remained. What happens if they never pay? Ben asked. Jonah shifted the truck into a lower gear for the hill. Then we learn what the answer cost. What answer? Jonah glanced at the black ledger on the seat between them. Whether a smaller hog that needs less purchased feed can outlast a larger one when corn gets too expensive. You don't know? No. Ben stared at him. You spent $682 on something you don't know? I spent it on the chance to measure it. Jonah's father had raised small black sows on the same hills before larger commercial hogs became common in Cedar Ridge County. The old man had never called them superior animals. His ledger recorded good years and bad ones with equal care. There were columns for corn used each week. Pigs born. Pigs weaned. Sows that failed to breed. Animals treated for sickness. And the number of days the herd grazed in woodland. Some entries mentioned acorns. Others mentioned fallen apples. Clover. Pumpkins. Garden waste and skim milk, traded from a neighboring dairy. One sentence had been underlined twice. Do not count what a hog weighs before counting what it costs to keep her there. Ben read that sentence on the first evening after the sale. So Granddad already proved it. Jonah shook his head. He recorded what happened on one farm with one herd. Isn't that proof? It's a question worth testing. Jonah turned to a blank page. Your grandfather left us a place to begin. He did not leave us an answer. The first year proved the crowd had a point. The first year nearly proved Preston right. The 4 groups had been managed differently before the sale. When Jonah placed them too close together, several animals pushed through an interior fence and scattered into the woodland. It took Jonah and Ben half a day to bring them back. Jonah rang the tin bell repeatedly. The hogs ignored it. One sow moved farther into the trees each time the sound came. Ben finally put the bell down. Preston was right about one thing. What? It doesn't make them grow. And it doesn't make them come back. Jonah picked it up again. Not yet. One group carried a heavier parasite burden than the others. 3 sows lost weight, even though they received more feed. 2 failed to raise enough pigs to justify keeping them. A mason boar that had appeared calm inside the auction pen became aggressive when moved near unfamiliar sows. Jonah removed him from the breeding program. The young gilts did not grow evenly. Some performed well on pasture, others required more corn, and still remained narrow. Jonah made another mistake by purchasing a full load of corn before he had separated the animals by need. Much of it went to hogs. He later decided not to retain. By the following spring, the feed expense was higher than he had planned. The first group of market pigs varied so much in weight that a local buyer discounted the entire lot. After transport and feed costs, Jonah had almost nothing left. Ben stood beside the empty loading pen after the buyer drove away. They were right. About what? These hogs eat money the same as big ones. Jonah looked toward the woodland, where several sows were rooting beneath the oaks. I bought hogs, he said. I haven't built a herd. From that day forward, every animal received a number. Jonah and Ben tagged the sows and gilts. They recorded which family lot each animal had come from. They separated breeding groups to avoid pairing animals that might be closely related. They weighed feed before carrying it into each paddock. They recorded litter sizes. They counted pigs born and pigs still alive at weaning. They noted which sows maintained body condition and which became thin. They examined feet after wet weather. They removed animals from the breeding program if poor mothering, weak feet, or repeated breeding failure made them too expensive to keep. Jonah did not retain the biggest gilts automatically. He kept the ones whose mothers raised healthy litters without excessive grain. He built portable farrowing huts from salvaged lumber and roofing metal. He moved them to high ground before wet weather. He divided the woodland with inexpensive fencing so the hogs could not remain in one place long enough to damage the soil. He planted clover in 2 open paddocks. He arranged to collect bruised apples from a small orchard and vegetables rejected by a produce stand. None of those materials were free. The orchard was 6 miles away. Transport required fuel and labor. Spoiled fruit could not be allowed to collect. The hogs still required minerals, clean water, and enough grain to maintain proper condition. Jonah recorded every expense. The tin bell became part of the system. At first, the animals ignored it. Jonah rang it immediately before feeding. Within 2 weeks, several sows began moving toward the sound. Within 2 months, most of the herd followed. By the next spring, Jonah could move a breeding group from one woodland paddock to another without chasing individual animals through the trees. Ben stood at a gate and watched 30 hogs pass him in less than 5 minutes. That bell is the only useful thing Preston gave us. Jonah closed the gate. He didn't give it to us to be useful. No, that doesn't mean we have to use it the way he intended. The mockery moved from the hogs to the man. People in town continued to laugh. At the feed store, Preston saw Jonah's order for clover seed, fencing staples, mineral salt, and only a small quantity of corn. A hog that doesn't eat corn isn't efficient. Preston said, "It's unfinished." Jonah folded the order sheet. "Then I suppose I'm still working." Preston noticed the black ledger under Ben's arm. "What is the boy doing with that?" "Keeping feed records," Jonah said. Preston held out his hand. Ben did not give him the book. Preston smiled. "A black ledger doesn't turn runts into breeding stock." Jonah reached for the order sheet. "No." Preston waited. The numbers inside it might. Several men near the counter stopped smiling. Preston leaned back. "You renamed feeding hogs in the woods and started calling it a system. I started writing down what it costs. Anyone can keep a notebook? Then more men should." The small black animals became known as Jonah's pocket hogs. Someone painted a board and placed it beside the road near the Hale farm. Hale's Piglet Ranch. The full-grown animals, not available. Ben pulled it from the ground before breakfast. Jonah told him to put it back. Why? The man who painted it spent more on the board than we did. That doesn't make it funny. No. They're laughing at us. Jonah looked toward the paddock, where a sow was leading 7 young pigs from the shade, then let them spend their breath. The sign remained beside the road. Jonah worked beneath it through winter rain and summer heat. The third level of mockery came several months later. Ben had begun presenting some of his feed comparisons at a youth agricultural meeting held in the back room of the feed store. He had written figures on a board. Purchased grain per pig weaned, litter survival, days on woodland pasture, cost of moving each breeding group. Preston entered near the end. He listened until Ben finished. Then he looked at Jonah. "Your father knew when small farming had reached its limit." The room became quiet. Preston pointed toward the black ledger. "You're turning a dead man's notebook into your boy's debt." Ben lowered his eyes. Jonah walked to the table and placed one hand on the ledger. For a moment, everyone expected him to answer Preston with anger. Instead, Jonah looked at his son. "Ben writes his own numbers." Then he closed the book and carried it out. The insult stayed with Ben longer than the jokes about small hogs. That night, he asked his father whether Preston was right. "About Granddad? About me paying for this later." Jonah sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You don't owe this herd your future. Then why teach me all of it?" "Because knowing how to measure a thing is useful whether you keep it or leave it." Ben looked toward the barn. "And if the herd fails?" Then the record should say so. The first small proof, 14 months after the liquidation sale, Jonah sold 18 market hogs. They were lighter than the animals Preston usually shipped. The price per pound was ordinary. Nothing about the sale attracted attention. But when Ben subtracted feed, veterinary expenses, transport, and fencing repairs, the group had produced a small profit. Not much. Enough to replace part of the barn roof. But not all of it. Enough to prove that lower weight did not automatically mean lower return when purchased feed was counted honestly. Ben checked the ledger 3 times. We made money. On one group, the feed cost was lower. It was. Then Granddad was right. Jonah shook his head. One profitable group proves a possibility. It does not prove a system. The more important evidence was still standing in the paddocks. 6 sows had raised consistent litters. Their feet remained sound. They maintained condition better than the others. Their pigs were not the largest. But the groups were becoming more even. Jonah marked those sows in the ledger. He also marked the animals that had failed. He did not erase a bad result because it weakened his argument. In the winter of 1950, Jonah wrote to the Carter, Bell, Mason, and Reed families. He listed the prices paid for their hogs. He copied the original earmarks and the new tag numbers. He explained which family lines remained in the herd. Then he made an offer. Until the first day of spring, any family could repurchase surviving females from its original line at the same price Jonah had paid per animal. Ben found the letters on the kitchen table. You want them to take the best sows back? They belong to those farms before they belong to us. We spent more feeding them than you paid. That is true. Then why charge only the old price? Because I'm not offering them the work we did. I'm offering them a way back into what they lost. None of the families could return to hog farming. Mrs. Bell wrote that her husband had found factory work in Tennessee. The Masons were living with relatives. The Reeds had moved west. Amos Carter returned to Cedar Ridge alone. He was thin, tired, and looking for work. He came to the Hale farm and stood outside the paddock, while several black sows moved through the trees. That one came from our place, he said. Jonah looked at the tag, Carter 17. My wife called her May. Jonah wrote the name beside the number. Amos helped repair farrowing huts and locate an old spring line near the upper woodland. He knew which Carter sows came from mothers that had raised good litters during poor years. Jonah paid him a small wage and promised a bonus if the next group sold profitably. Ben asked why Jonah continued referring to breeding groups as the Carter line, Bell line, and Mason line. We own them now, Ben said. We own the animals. What's the difference? We don't own the years that made them. By the spring of 1951, the Hale herd was no longer a mixed collection from 4 liquidation pens. It had become a controlled breeding program. Jonah retained 31 proven sows, 3 boars from separate lines, and a group of promising gilts. He had removed animals that required too much feed, failed to breed consistently, or developed poor feet. Ben had become responsible for the feed records. He weighed grain and recorded the amount used by each group. He calculated purchased feed per pig, weaned. He tracked time spent on pasture and the cost of hauling orchard culls. The numbers were improving. Then the rain stopped. 23 days of feed. By June, the clover had begun turning brown. By July, the spring above the upper paddock had slowed to a thin stream. The oak crop failed. The orchard produced fewer apples, leaving almost no culls to collect. Corn prices rose across the county. Large operators felt the increase first because they purchased grain by the truckload. But Jonah's herd could not live on dry woodland and good intentions. The sows required feed. The young stock needed enough energy to grow. Jonah purchased more corn. The feed column in the ledger climbed week after week. 3 sows failed to breed again on schedule. Several young animals lost condition. A restaurant owner from Little Rock, who had shown interest in pasture-raised pork, asked Jonah whether he could guarantee a finished weight and delivery date. Jonah studied the animals before answering. No. The restaurant owner withdrew. By the time his car reached town, the story had changed. At the feed store, men heard that the only buyer Jonah had found took one look at the hog's weights and walked away. The truth was that the buyer had never inspected the herd. Jonah had lost the order because he refused to promise a result he could not guarantee. The rumor was easier to laugh at. Ben measured the grain remaining in the feed bin. He calculated each ration twice. At the current rate, he said, we have 23 days. Jonah looked at the figures. If we sell the market animals early, 31 days, maybe 34 if the weather cools. And the foundation sows? They have to hold condition through the next breeding window. If they don't, we lose almost a year. The crisis was no longer simply that feed had become expensive. Every day forced Jonah closer to one of three choices: buy corn he could not afford, sell the foundation animals that made the system work, or let the sows lose enough condition to damage the next breeding season. The barn roof still leaked. The old well pump made a hard knocking sound each time it started. The farm's cash reserve was nearly gone. Then Jonah found a letter in the ledger. It was addressed to Ben. A state agricultural school had offered him a place in a short training program beginning that winter. The program included housing and a small work allowance. You didn't show me this, Jonah said. Ben kept weighing feed. You needed help here. You don't owe this herd your future. I know. Then why haven't you answered? Ben set the scoop down. Because you keep saying the records matter. They do. And I'm the only other person who understands all of them. That still doesn't make them your debt. Ben looked toward the brown paddock. Then stop asking me to measure something you plan to sell apart. Jonah did not answer. That evening, Ben carried water to the lower group while Jonah remained at the kitchen table. The black ledger lay open beside the liquidation sale receipt, $682. Near it was the most recent bank appraisal of the Hale farm, $4,600. The hogs were not dying, but every visible result appeared to be moving backward. For the first time since the auction, Jonah wondered whether he had mistaken endurance for value. Perhaps the small hogs were not efficient. Perhaps they had merely failed more slowly. He closed the ledger. His hand remained on the cover for several seconds. Before sunrise, Jonah loaded 2 empty water barrels onto the farm truck. Ben found him near the barn. Where are you going? Upper Woodland. The spring is almost dry. That is why I'm taking water. Ben climbed into the truck. He did not apologize for doubting the herd. Jonah did not ask him to. They spent the morning changing the system. They moved the foundation sows to the best shaded paddock. They sold several market animals earlier than planned to reduce pressure on feed and water. They separated young stock, according to need rather than age. They stopped protecting breeding lines that had not earned their place in the herd. 2 attractive gilts were sold because their mothers had required too much grain. Ben noticed something while comparing the records with figures from several neighboring operations. Jonah's animals were losing weight. But the decline was slower than in larger hogs, receiving reduced grain rations. The smaller sows were not performing well. They were simply holding together longer. We aren't winning, Ben said. Jonah looked at the brown hillside. No, but we're losing slower. That matters only if we use the time. Preston offered to buy the years apart. 2 weeks later, Preston Vale drove to the Hale farm. He arrived in the afternoon while Jonah and Ben were repairing a water line. Preston removed a leather folder from his car. I heard you're cutting numbers. Some? I also heard the restaurant buyer walked away. He did. Preston opened the folder. I can solve part of your problem. He offered $1,450 for 12 of Jonah's best sows and 2 proven boars. The money was enough to purchase winter feed, repair the barn roof, and recover more than twice Jonah's original auction investment. Ben read the figure. Preston watched his face. You can keep the rest. He said, sell me the animals that have value and stop carrying the ones that don't. Jonah studied the list. The 12 sows represented his 3 strongest maternal lines. The 2 boars allowed him to keep those lines separated without breeding too closely. Selling 14 animals would not reduce the herd. It would dismantle it. Why these? Jonah asked. Sound feet. Consistent litters. They maintain condition. You've been reading our records? People talk. Preston closed the folder. You wanted to prove small hogs could pay. Fine. Recover your money while you can. Jonah returned the offer. No. Preston stared at him. You have a $12 roof patch over a $4,600 farm. That patch has lasted 3 years. The feed bill won't. I know. Then take the money. Jonah looked toward the breeding paddock. You're not offering $1,450 for 14 hogs? What am I offering it for? The years behind them. Preston's expression hardened. Years don't weigh anything at market. Then you don't need them. For the first time since the county sale, Preston left without laughing. The policy that was not supposed to be about Jonah. The following week, the Cedar Ridge County Swine Association held a special meeting. Preston chaired it. Jonah did not attend. Frank Dillard later brought him a typed copy of the new rule. It stated that county livestock facilities could not be used to promote mixed source or unregistered animals as tested breeding stock unless the herd first received independent veterinary clearance, certified scale records, third-party performance verification, documented breeding separation, and a review of all production claims made to an outside buyer. Preston explained the rule at the meeting in language no reasonable farmer could easily oppose. This is not about Jonah Hale, he said. It is about protecting Cedar Ridge County from unsupported breeding claims. He argued that the animals had originated on 4 farms. The herd had no recognized registration papers. Most of the records had been kept by the owner and his son, and an outside buyer might rely on the county's reputation when making a purchase. Every statement was technically true. The rule did not accuse Jonah of fraud. It simply required verification that cost money Jonah did not have. The sale barn manager withdrew the inspection date he had tentatively offered. Daniel Reeves, the distant buyer who had begun asking about the herd, postponed his trip until the requirements could be satisfied. Around town, the delay was described as proof that the buyer had lost interest. Ben read the policy twice. He did this because you refused the offer. We don't know that. You know. Jonah folded the paper. I know what the rule says. What are we going to do? Jonah drove to the bank. Preston received him in the front office. Jonah placed the policy on the desk. Is the rule written? You're holding it? Does it apply to every herd using county facilities? It does. Who qualifies as independent? Preston leaned back. A licensed veterinarian. The county agricultural agent and certified scale personnel. Jonah picked up the paper. Then we'll meet it. Preston studied him. The testing will cost money. I expect it will. And if your records do not hold up, the buyer will know? He should. For the first time, Preston looked uncertain. He had expected resistance. Instead, Jonah accepted the standard. Meeting it required another sacrifice. Jonah sold several market hogs earlier than planned. The animals brought less than they would have at full finish weight. He used the money to pay for health testing, certified weights, and veterinary examinations. The barn roof repair was postponed again. Ben asked what would happen if the independent review proved Preston right. Jonah answered without hesitation. Then we learn it before Daniel pays for our mistake. The rule Preston had used to slow the sale became the structure of the strongest test the herd had ever faced. The records were tested. County agricultural agent Frank Dillard did not congratulate Jonah. He asked questions. How much purchased feed per pig weaned? Ben gave him the figure. How are you counting orchard waste, hauling cost, labor, and spoilage? Mortality? Recorded by litter. Animals removed from the breeding program? Jonah opened another page. Frank studied the entries. You have records. Jonah waited. Frank closed the book. You do not yet have a fair comparison. He proposed a 6-month review. The Hale Foundation herd would be compared with available county figures for similar-size breeding operations. The review would track purchased feed, pigs weaned per sow, breeding intervals, foot trouble, mortality, veterinary treatment, body condition retention. Frank also wanted to measure something Jonah had not considered a product. Handling time. How long does it take 2 men to move the herd? He asked. Depends where they're going. Then record it. For 6 months? Ben wrote down everything. Good results. Bad results. Delayed breeding. Feed increases. A sow treated for infection. A litter that lost 2 pigs. the number of minutes required to move each breeding group, the tin bell worked well in normal conditions. During one late summer test, however, a group of young gilts hesitated because an unfamiliar truck had been parked beside the lane. Ben rang the bell again. The animals did not move. For several minutes, the system appeared to fail. Jonah did not force them. He moved the truck, opened the sight line, and allowed the lead sow to enter first. The group followed. Ben recorded the delay. He did not remove it from the handling average. When the comparison ended, the Hale hogs were not the largest animals in the county. Their market offspring did not reach slaughter weight faster than Preston's hogs. But the foundation sows used nearly 1/3 less purchased feed per pig weaned than the comparison group. They experienced fewer foot problems on the rocky ground. The strongest maternal lines weaned more pigs than their size suggested. The herd could be moved between portable lanes by 2 people in a fraction of the time normally required for untrained animals. The veterinarian's random checks matched the health records. Certified scale figures matched Ben's handwritten weights within acceptable differences. The breeding map showed that the 3 boars maintained separate pairings across the retained maternal lines. Frank returned the ledger to Ben. They are not the biggest hogs in Cedar Ridge County. Ben looked disappointed. Frank continued. That was never the product. He prepared a written summary for the association. At the bottom, he added one sentence. The Hale herd has met the independent verification requirements adopted for the use of Cedar Ridge County livestock facilities. Preston's policy had not stopped the herd. It had certified it. Why a buyer drove 600 miles. A copy of Frank's report reached Daniel Reeves at the Blue Ridge Orchard and Provision Company in North Carolina. Blue Ridge managed more than 1,500 acres of orchard and woodland. The company sold fruit, cured meat, and provisions to stores across the mountain region. It had 2 problems. Thousands of pounds of bruised or undersized fruit had little commercial value. At the same time, the company's plan to expand pasture-raised pork was failing because purchased feed made the numbers too high. Blue Ridge had bought sows from several farms. The animals arrived with incomplete records, unrelated health histories, and no consistent handling system. Some performed well, others did not. The company had a cured pork contract scheduled to begin the following year. Daniel Reeves did not have 3 years to build a foundation herd from scattered animals. He wrote to Jonah. The letter did not contain an offer. It contained questions. Daniel requested health certificates, litter records, feed invoices, breeding maps, mortality figures, a list of every animal removed from the program, evidence that the 3 boars came from sufficiently separate lines, independent confirmation of body condition and foot soundness, and proof that the animals could be handled together under unfamiliar conditions. Ben read the letter twice. He's interested. He's investigating. Jonah said, What do we send? Everything he asked for, including the failed sows, especially those. They sent records showing that 3 sows had failed to breed during the drought. They disclosed that one young group had grown more slowly than expected. They included the restaurant order Jonah had lost. They explained why several attractive animals had been removed from the breeding program. Preston also sent Daniel a copy of the county association policy. His accompanying letter was professional. It stated that the Hale animals were not registered, did not represent conventional commercial uniformity, and had only recently completed independent validation. Nothing in the letter was false. Daniel postponed his visit until the final veterinary signatures were complete. For nearly 3 months, Blue Ridge checked what Jonah and Ben claimed. The buyer did not appear like a miracle. The distant market did not create the herd's value. It only began examining work already done. During that time, people in Cedar Ridge began viewing the Hale farm differently. At the feed store, Preston said Jonah had simply been fortunate to own woodland during high feed prices. Amos Carter was standing beside the counter. The woods were there before Jonah bought those hogs. Amos said. Preston turned toward him. Amos continued. The records weren't. At the next agricultural meeting, Frank presented the 6-month comparison. Farmers who had once asked why Jonah kept small hogs now asked how he measured feed use. They asked why he removed certain large gilts. They asked how the portable lanes worked. Some drove slowly past the Hale farm, no longer waiting to see it fail. They were trying to understand what Jonah had built. In early October 1952, Daniel Reeves called. He wanted to inspect the herd personally. He would bring Blue Ridge's veterinarian and herd manager, because the county sale barn had certified scales, loading alleys, and enough holding space to separate the breeding groups. Jonah requested permission to conduct the inspection there. Under the association policy, the herd now qualified. The date was October 16. Preston heard about the visit before Jonah told anyone in town. By the time the 3 trucks arrived from North Carolina, farmers had gathered along the rails. The inspection. Daniel did not begin with the largest sow. He selected an ear tag number at random. Ben found the page. Daniel compared the sow's age, litter history, treatment record, and breeding status with the animal standing in the pen. He selected another, then another. The veterinarian examined feet, udders, teeth, and body condition. The herd manager inspected the breeding map and questioned Jonah about the 3 boars. "What happens if we remove the Mason boar?" he asked. "You lose the safest pairing for 6 of the bred gilts. Could we replace him?" "Yes." "How long before you would trust the replacement?" 2 litters. If the first one looked right, Daniel looked up. "Not one? One litter can lie to you." They tested the records for nearly 4 hours. Frank placed the independent verification report beside the veterinary certificates. Every requirement in the association policy had been met. At noon, Daniel asked Jonah to move the first breeding group from the outer holding lot into the sale pens. No pushing boards. No extra workers. Jonah gave the tin bell to Ben. Ben stepped into the alley and rang twice. The sows came from the far side of the lot. The boar followed behind them. They entered the lane, turned through the gate, and moved into the correct pen. The second group did the same. One gilt hesitated at the corner. Ben waited instead of striking her. She followed the group. The third pen filled. Daniel checked his watch. Preston stood near the auction office. He had spent years teaching farmers that the value of a hog could be judged by weight, growth, and uniformity. Jonah's animals were still smaller than his, but Preston was no longer looking at the same product. Daniel entered the office. The crowd moved closer to the windows. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked at Jonah. "I can't use 31 sows." Outside the office, someone whispered. Ben's face tightened. Preston lowered his eyes, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Daniel continued. "Not without all 18 bred gilts and all 3 boars." The room became still. "If you remove the strongest females or break the breeding lines apart." I am back where I started buying individual hogs from separate farms and spending 3 years finding out whether they belong together. Daniel opened his case. I did not drive 600 miles for the pieces. He placed the first document on the desk. The Cedar Ridge Farm Bank appraisal. $4,600. Then Jonah removed Preston's earlier offer from the black ledger. $1,450 for 12 sows and 2 boars. Daniel examined the signature. He placed it beside the appraisal. Finally, he laid down the Blue Ridge offer. $5,250 for 31 proven sows, 3 boars, 18 bred gilts, copies of the health records, the breeding map, the feed performance records, and transfer assistance sufficient to preserve the 3 breeding groups. Daniel looked at Preston. "Is the $4,600 appraisal yours?" "Yes." "And is the $1,450 foundation animal offer yours?" Preston did not answer immediately. "Mr. Weil?" "Yes." Daniel touched the second paper. "Then you recognized the value in these breeding lines before I ever drove here." "I recognized several useful animals." "You priced the pieces." Daniel placed one hand on the Blue Ridge offer. "I'm pricing the system." Preston looked toward the pens. "You could buy larger registered hogs for less. I could buy animals for less." Daniel pointed toward the independent report. "I cannot buy 3 years of selection for less." He turned another page. "I cannot buy 3 years of honest failure records for less." Another page. "I cannot buy 3 protected breeding lines. Proven maternal performance." verified feed figures, and a herd. 2 men can move without tearing apart a loading barn for less. Frank stepped forward. The herd met every verification requirement adopted by the association. The policy Preston had introduced was now part of the public record, proving Jonah's work. Daniel put one finger on the farm appraisal. "I'm not paying more than the farm is worth." Then he touched Jonah's records. "I'm paying for the part this appraisal never learned how to measure." No one laughed. The bell rang again. Jonah signed the transfer documents. Ben carried the black ledger to the office copier so Blue Ridge could receive a complete duplicate. The original stayed with the Hale family. Then the truck loading began. Ben rang the tin bell. The first breeding group entered the alley. The sound that had begun as a joke now brought 31 proven sows forward in orderly groups. The 3 boars loaded into separate compartments. The bred gilts followed. At each marked gate, the correct group turned into the correct lane. Daniel stood beside the truck and watched the system hold together. When the final breeding group passed the scale gate, he said quietly, "That is what I bought. Not a single oversized show animal. Not a secret rare breed. Not a lucky litter. A complete operating herd backed by records." The man who had painted the roadside sign stood near the loading gate without speaking. Several farmers who had called them pocket hogs watched the veterinarian sign the final health papers. Preston remained beside the office. The same bell he had used to humiliate Jonah now directed animals worth more than the bank's appraisal of the entire Hale farm. When the last gate closed, Daniel shook Jonah's hand. "You're selling the whole proven herd. That is the agreement?" Hard thing to watch leave. Jonah looked toward the trucks. "Yes. You could have kept part of it. Then you would not be buying what you came for." Daniel nodded. He understood. The product was not a collection of selected animals, with the best ones removed. The product was the complete operating foundation Blue Ridge needed. The last offer. A week after the trucks left, Preston came to the Hale farm. He brought another folder. This one contained a proposal from a bank-backed livestock company to purchase Jonah's land. The sale of the herd had made the farm more attractive. It had functioning paddocks, improved water points, portable facilities, and documented low-input performance. Preston placed the proposal on the hood of Jonah's truck. "You proved your point." Jonah did not open the folder. "I wasn't making one. You can sell the farm. To move into town and invest part of the money. You will never receive a better offer." "Better for whom? You just sold the animals that made the place valuable." "I sold one herd." Preston looked toward the nearly empty paddocks. One herd that became valuable because feed prices changed. Corn got expensive for every hogman in the county. That created the market. It revealed the difference. Preston waited. Jonah continued. "The difference was what we had built before it happened." Preston glanced at the barn. The old roadside sign had been removed. The tin bell hung beside the doorway. You were lucky a buyer needed exactly what you had. Jonah looked across the road toward Preston's car. "And now your company needs the land where it was built." Preston did not answer. Jonah handed the proposal back, unopened. He did not demand an apology. He did not remind Preston of every joke made at the sale barn. He did not ask why a man who had called the hogs feed bills with ears had later offered $1,450 for the center of their breeding system. The 3 papers on the auction desk had already asked that question. The trucks had already answered it. The second Hale herd. Jonah used the herd money carefully. He repaired the barn roof. He replaced the failing well pump. He paid Amos Carter the promised bonus. He kept the Hale farm free of debt. He also helped Frank Dillard create a basic record program for small livestock producers who could not afford expensive equipment or registered breeding stock. Jonah did not tell them to raise small black hogs. He taught them to measure the animals they already owned. Feed cost, survival, mothering, feet, health, labor. The cost of keeping an animal long enough to discover whether it truly belonged in a herd. Blue Ridge had purchased every animal in Jonah's proven breeding program, but 6 young gilts had been weaned too recently to qualify for the sale. 2 young boars from recorded lines also remained. They were not a proven herd. They were only a beginning. Ben accepted the place in the winter agricultural program. Before leaving, he carried the black ledger into the barn. He opened it to the first blank page after the Blue Ridge transfer. For several minutes, he studied the old handwriting, his grandfather's feed notes, his father's breeding records, the drought figures he had written himself. Then he entered a new heading. Second Hale herd. 6 gilts. Tfo boars. No assumptions. Jonah read the line. That last part matters. Ben closed the ledger. I know. Outside. The 8 young hogs rested beneath the orchard trees. They were small, unproven, worth no more than ordinary young stock to anyone passing on the road. Ben lifted the tin feed bell and rang it once. 8 black heads rose from the shade. The young animals came toward him. Jonah Hale never became the wealthiest farmer in Cedar Ridge County. His farm remained 76 acres. The hills stayed rocky. The barn remained smaller than Preston Vale's machinery shed. But people remembered the day 3 trucks came from North Carolina. They remembered the appraisal of $4,600. They remembered Preston's offer of $1,450 for the foundation pieces. They remembered the Blue Ridge offer of $5,250 for the complete system. They remembered Preston confirming all 3 papers. And they remembered the small black hogs moving toward the loading alley when the bell rang. The lesson was not that small hogs were always more valuable than large ones. It was not that every old animal represented a hidden fortune. And it was not that a distant buyer would rescue every farmer who refused to follow the market. Jonah's hogs became valuable because he admitted their weaknesses, measured their costs, to remove the animals that failed, and spent 3 years building consistency, where other people saw only small bodies and mixed bloodlines. The drought did not create that value. The buyer did not create it. High corn prices did not create it. Preston's policy did not create it either. Those things merely tested the value and made it visible. The real work had happened earlier. While the county was still laughing, it happened while the bell meant humiliation. While the ledger looked old-fashioned, while the first sale barely made money, while the feed bin held only 23 days, while the buyer walked away because Jonah refused to promise what he could not deliver, while the association rule delayed the inspection, and while a father and son continued writing down numbers that no one else believed mattered, sometimes the farm's most valuable asset is not the biggest animal, the newest barn, or the highest number written on an appraisal. Sometimes it is the years of honest work no buyer can purchase until someone has already lived through them.